One.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Talti, environmental journalist here for Southfork Sea Farmers with Dr. Carl Safina, award-winning writer and environmentalist. I'm very excited for today's episode. It's a really big treat that we have Dr. Safina with us. His lyrical nonfiction writing explores how humans are changing the living world and what those changes mean for non-human beings and for us all. He has won the Lanham Literary Award, Orion Book Award, the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and if I listed all of them, we would be here all day. His 2011 book, The View from Lazy Point, focuses on the natural world of the East End, and I recommend it as a must-read for all South Fork residents. And his most recent book is Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. So, Dr. Safina, Carl, your writing takes readers all over the world. And you've been able to share these humanizing stories from turtles to the tuna. Can we talk a little bit about your more locally focused book, View from the Lazy Point? What have been some of the surprising takeaways that you learned while writing and reporting for that?
Well, I mean, maybe not too surprising. And the reason I wrote the book is that we live in a place that is so richly filled with life and, is so dynamic seasonally. We have the bird migrations, the fish migrations, the turtles and the whales. We have all kinds of stuff that comes and goes from around here. I think the most surprising thing is that two of my neighbors who read the book each said, I've been here for 40 years and I've never seen any of the stuff you wrote about. And that's really, that is a little shocking because it's here and, to me, it's part of our lives and it makes the region. And yet a lot of people are not focused on the seasons and on the comings and goings of all these living creatures. And that's a tremendous shame that that they miss that.
And do you hope that, obviously some of the books and your writings take you to these very exotic locations or places that maybe the average American or South Fork resident wouldn't have access to. But do you hope that your writing can show that there are these stories in everyone's backyard?
Yes, absolutely. You think of an exotic place, it's just a place. It's not exotic if you live there. This place is as exotic as any other place in the world. There are people who don't live here who think, oh my God, the East End of Long Island, people have written about it and it's so incredible. But if you live here or wherever you happen to live, usually people take it for granted and they just assume it's just an average place. But really every place is extraordinary in its own way. This is a particularly extraordinary place.
And was that the impetus behind The View from Lazy Point? The reporting for it was a bit unique. I really liked the premise.
Yeah, it's hyper local and it's also global at the same time because at different times during this year, the subtitle is A Natural Year in an Unnatural World. And I go very far during the course of that year, but obviously keep coming back home. And so I think just that dynamic of trying to show how special this place is and put it in a global context.
And I heard actually from some of the film people behind the scenes that now South Fork Sea Farmers have some oyster farms at Lazy Point.
Yeah, there are some starting, yes.
And do you kind of like that mixed use of a place?
Well, I like when people use their place for their use. What I don't love is the commercialization of a natural place. And there's a tension right now with farming, sea farming, that some people are doing it because they're trying to grow some food, and other people are trying to grow businesses. And that can create some problems. The main problem with the business side of it is that there are large areas in which people can get leases, and when the lease system was set up, everybody assumed oysters grow on the bottom, but now they all grow in floating cages. So there's a possibility of having large areas of water, which have always been the public's water, off limits to public use because they have floating cages in them. And this is analogous to telling people that they can start a commercial farm in a county park. So there's a tension with that.
I know we've talked about that with regards to kelp farming as well. And, I think when you look at the seafood industry globally, America's definitely behind in terms of aquaculture. And I know through your work, you visited some of these like huge fish farms in Asia.
Right.
And
And Central America and Mexico. And, you don't see open bays. You see demolished wetlands that all look like murky swimming pools and are growing mostly shrimp or catfish or something like that. And you see bays that are kind of like Napeague Harbor, and you can walk across the cages. We value public space and open water, and we use it. And there is no pleasure boating in a lot of these places. People are very, very poor, and they just need to do anything to make some money. And there are other people who are willing and able to exploit that possibility and don't care anything about the environment because they don't have wetlands protection laws or anything like that. So it can be a gigantic mess. And that's why it really needs to be done very, very thoughtfully.
So do you feel like, I think when I talk to a lot of environmentalists, there's this whole push for more American seafood and domestic production. Do you think that based on what you've seen abroad, that maybe we're actually in a better place because we can kind of think of how to do it responsibly and look at
If we
places.
think of how to do it responsibly, yes. The thing is, there are a lot of unforeseens. Like floating cages was unforeseen, and I think rather than say you can do this until we realize that we didn't think of something, I think that what you can do should be very, very narrowly proscribed. Just for instance, on the west coast of the United States, there were people who started growing clams, and they started to have a problem with a little thing called a mantis shrimp, which is a native animal. We have a few of them here. The mantis shrimp were preying on the little baby clams, the little tiny ones with, not hardened shells. So they started spraying pesticides in the public waters to kill the mantis shrimp. That's not good. And that has not been foreseen here, even though there was a whole series of lawsuits on the West Coast. But the people here I don't think they have really a big perspective about what could be positive and what could go wrong.
So you feel like the legislation is more focused on the kind of positive benefits and not thinking of bad actors.
Right. Well, not thinking of bad actors or really thinking of limits, because there's a limit to how many leases they can give per year, and there's a huge amount of water that they could potentially lease. And if they leased everything and it got full of floating cages, that would be, it would transform the idea of this as a place where the public has access to public water. It would be a different place. And, one thing about farming is farming tends not to get along very well with nature. So when I brought up at one of these meetings that on the West Coast they had a problem with people putting pesticides in the water for the mantis shrimp, one farmer said, "Oh, I would never do anything like that. I kill all the crabs with a hammer." But the point is he kills all the crabs. That's the point. It's that, if you're not a farmer, crabs are not a problem. If you're a farmer, crabs are a problem. Or if you're growing fish or shrimp, birds become a problem. Or if you're not, insects become a problem or coyotes become a problem. There's problems with agriculture and nature. And it's, arguably, you could make a very strong argument that the biggest problem for nature is agriculture. So not going into that with both eyes open and a broad perspective is an invitation to have things happen that are unfortunate.
Well, I think given, your work, I think if you're worried about it, hopefully other people are as well. Your book, Song for the Blue Ocean, kind of changed the sustainable seafood industry's stance on bluefin tuna, and was really forward thinking for its time. Was that your hope with the book?
Well, yeah. There's three sections of that book. One is about bluefin tuna, the other is about salmon, and the other is about coral reefs and coral reef fisheries, mostly in the tropics. And before I wrote it, I started to realize that the management of bluefin tuna, which, is a thing here locally and on this coast, was really horrendous, that they were managing a deep depletion of the species. And I started going to these management meetings, and I realized that what they do is people from different countries all come and try to get the biggest quota that they can for their country. And then if they get a bigger quota, they go home and they get congratulated, and all the fishermen there like them. So they're supposed to be organizing a coordinated conservation plan to make sure that they don't deplete the fish. That's what they're supposed to be doing. It's not at all what they were doing. And I thought that maybe shining a light on that would change the conditions under which they really could talk about and operate. I would say it was a partial success. And I think that and all the other things that the environmental groups started doing and getting involved with that, I think helped to arrest the decline. And there's pretty good indication that there's a bit of recovery from that low point. But it got very, very low, and the recovery is very slow. And, everybody really values this fish in a couple of different ways. And they're one of the most incredible animals in the world. They're supposed to be very abundant. And when I was a kid, they were very abundant. And, to watch those things get really scarce was horrible. We lost that abundance, and we had to engage in all these really bitter and nasty disputes with the managers and then with the fishermen, and then it's different kinds of fishermen against each other, all blaming each other for different things. The harpooners blame the netters, and the netters blame the rod and reelers, and the anglers blame the commercial people. We shouldn't have that.
One thing that I thought was interesting in that was, the American fishermen then blaming like all of the overseas boats in the Gulf of Mexico, but then also saying that the bluefin is back, but then also saying that oh no, it's actually much less than when I was a kid.
Yeah. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, and there's also a lot of posturing. Not everybody says what's really on their mind. They often say what kind of benefits skewing the game toward them. So I have literally had people say to me, quote, "There is no problem. They're the problem. There is no problem." Well, those two things can't be true at the same time.
And so one thing that one of your quotes, "We are borrowing heavily from a world not yet born." Is that one thing that motivates your writing now?
Yes. I mean, a lot of my views about our relationship with the natural world have to do with a sense of justice and ethics and, I feel that we have certain moral obligations to people that we're handing the world to. You could say we don't. I think we do. They're the ultimate voiceless people. They're not here to argue on behalf of their interests and what they will want and what they will need. We could if we cared about them, and I think we should care about them.
And when you look to the new generation, there's activists like Greta Thunberg. We did a Southwark Sea Farmers episode in Southampton School last month, and these kids are talking about climate crisis. I feel very inspired by them. Do you think that they are kind of speaking to what you're writing for?
Yeah, in a sense, that's true. I mean, when I came of age and I was in college in the 1970s, I thought we were going to fix everything. We had all the new environmental laws, and we realized that these were problems. And then a lot of people just did not stick with the program, and a lot of things, really backslid. One thing about young people nowadays is, well, first of all, I don't think we should depend on them to fix anything. I think we should not hand them a broken world. I think that's deeply, deeply wrong. But my students are, they're emotionally in turmoil about what the world is going to look like in their lifetime. And since they're studying environmental management and things like that, they actually don't know if this is a good field to get into. They think it will be too depressing. They think it's too ruined. They think maybe they should change majors now while they can. And they have these crises, which we have to talk about in class. We have to talk about grief management, professional grief management, meaning about your own profession. We have to talk about that in my class. We can't just converse about the topics because the topics are really too overwhelming. So we have to talk about, how to achieve emotional balance so that you don't burn out and you can continue to work and see positive things, or at least see why your work is worthwhile, because there is this real crisis.
And was that something that when you got into this field, when you in the 70s or 80s, did you talk about grief management as part of being?
2 years ago is when we started, out of my
Wow.
entire lifetime, 2 years ago. And we started because several students asked me after class, well, in emails, outside of class, we feel like we feel overwhelmed, and is there anything you can tell us? So we had a meeting at my house, actually, with the students, and it was during the first year of COVID, when I hadn't actually met any of them in person. I first met them in person when they came to my house to talk about how they felt emotionally overwhelmed. And we sat outside because of COVID, and we had a pizza, and we talked about these things. And this year I brought it up as part of the curriculum in the class, and we could have had the whole course focused on this topic.
Wow, it's kind of heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. I mean, I'm not here to teach bright students who want to do something positive in their life how to cope with the enormity of the problems we're dumping on them. That's not really the idea, but that's the reality.
Wow. Yeah, I think in a lot of your books, you do such a great job at explaining animal culture or fish culture, and, kind of illuminating things that we may not see, the average person may not see. And then in your news writings, you share a lot more, I think, about human culture and our effect on the environment. And Connected by Culture, you talk a lot about the past knowledge from one generation to another, and you end on a hopeful note about the presence of humpback whales off the South Shore. What knowledge, habits, and skills should we be embracing as part of the human culture to fulfill your hope for the future?
Well, caring about the future is a good start. And one of the things that I find very energizing is that some of the things that looked lost when I was a teenager or in my early 20s are back very abundantly now. We thought ospreys might go extinct. Bald eagles were really on their way to going extinct. There are a lot of them now. I mean, ospreys are very abundant now, much more so than ever in my lifetime. And the East Coast is actually one of the osprey hotspots of the world. That's partly due to the recovery of all the menhaden, which we call bunker, those fish, which exist now in schools that are miles long. I never thought they could even be that abundant, but because they finally put a cap on the catch in 2012, I think it was, they've had 10 years of recovery.
Oh, wow.
And that has brought these humpback whales, which humpback whales have been recovering for decades from also being almost extinct. So I grew up at a time when I thought, by the time I'm my age, there'll be no more ospreys, no more bald eagles, no more humpback whales, no more fish. But a few people felt that's not a good answer, and it's unacceptable to have, to be heading in that direction. And they devoted a lot of time and effort to changing policies, changing laws, changing regulations, and protecting things, and eliminating some of the worst pesticides that were killing the ospreys and the eagles, stopping the whaling. That took 20 years of bitter fighting to stop killing the whales. Sometimes people think, well, most of the whales were killed in the Moby Dick days of the sailing ships. Most of the whales were killed in the 1960s. That's when hundreds of thousands of them were killed. And all of that got turned around. Now we have other gigantic problems that we must turn around, or the results will be catastrophic. But at least I've seen how that can work. And it can work if a few people care enough to never give up and they succeed. So when I was young, I didn't think we would have what we still have. And I never thought it would be more abundant than I could imagine. But we often see whales while we're just walking on the beach with our dogs. I've lost count of how many osprey nests there are within 2 miles of the house. Bald eagles used to be very exciting. Oh my God, I saw an eagle. Now, it's not that uncommon to see an eagle. I saw one today as I was driving here.
Yeah, I think those positive natural stories really speak to as well when you have the local community that does care about the environment, the kind of power that they have. Also we've seen the return of the striped bass, piping plovers. That's a huge effort to protect their nesting. What other kind of cultural shifts do you think would be beneficial from an environmental perspective? Like if there were more brown lawns in August in suburbia?
Well, I take care of my lawn in a very atypical way. Usually I mow it.
Lawns are a hot topic on South Fork Sea Farmers.
Usually I mow it. I never apply anything to it. I never, in my entire life, I have never put any kind of fertilizer or any kind of pesticide on anything. My vegetable garden, we fertilize just with the poop from my chicken coop. And obviously, the water quality here has a very inverse relationship to the amount of pesticides and fertilizers that are used, largely on lawns, also on farms. And that stuff is not good for water quality. So I don't really mind if my lawn looks brown in August when it's hot and dry. That's what plants do. That's what grass does. And then it comes back. So, okay, that's all right with me. This year we did something that we hadn't done before. There's this little movement called No Mow May. You don't mow during the month of May when a lot of the stuff in the lawn is actually flowering, so that the bees and other pollinators can have something to eat. And my lawn looks wilder than it ever has before because I haven't mowed it yet, and it's gotten very tall. But an interesting thing is all the grass has seed heads on it. I actually, because I've always mowed it, I didn't know the seed heads come this early in the season. So the grass is kind of tall, it has seed heads, it's starting to flop over a little bit, and the chickens are eating all the seed heads. So it's really fun, and it's great to see.
So do you think your lawn will be better next year then because of no mow May and the
Well, I'll
chicken?
tell you one thing, it's going to self-seed, and it'll probably be thicker next year, and the chickens are eating, and the chickens are pooping in the lawn, so they're fertilizing. I mean, it's kind of like the way it's supposed to all be. And we have kind of a lot of bugs in the yard. We see a lot of bees, and we have some butterflies that come, and all of that is really good.
Yeah, it's interesting when you take a step back and kind of let nature work on itself, how, humans can interrupt that cycle.
Yeah.
On that concept, I know we've spoken before about the wind farms on Long Island, and obviously you're a very big proponent for green energy. You have a very unique view on them. So, what are your fears around the wind farms? Why do you think that PSEG is pushing them? What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, well, PSE&G is pushing the wind farms so they can stay in business because they know that decentralized green energy. In other words, if everybody
panels.
simply had solar panels on all their roofs, we wouldn't need an energy monopoly that controls the price. And the only way that they can continue to be a monopoly is to industrialize the wild ocean. That's really their only option right now. So either you would have hundreds of solar businesses and thousands of jobs, and shallow geothermal is another thing that is a green option. If you go down a few feet, it's always about 50 or 55 degrees. If you dig down about 6 feet, the soil is cool. And so if you pipe that coolness into your house, or you pipe 50 or 55 degrees into your house, if it's 80 degrees outside and you want air conditioning, well, that cool air is in the ground. And if it's 20 degrees outside and you want it hot, you can start out by piping 50-degree air into the house. And that's called shallow geothermal. That's another thing that takes a huge strain off of air conditioning and oil burners. I went on a flight in a small plane last summer with a colleague, and I was really shocked to see the amount of roof area of just warehouse. It's surprising how many warehouses there are on Long Island, because they're not retail businesses, so they're sort of off where you don't see them. But there are huge roof areas, and then of course there's every shopping center has a parking lot that could be a giant solar panel. I mean, the whole thing could be a giant solar panel. We could produce so much energy, but instead we have a monopoly that has figured out how to stay in business and prevent all of this decentralized, thousands of jobs, opportunities from actually happening. And the ocean is going to look like Kennedy Airport because it's all going to be red blinking lights at night. Their very sly and dishonest slogan was clean energy is just over the horizon. Well, you can see those things from 25 miles away, and they're not just over the horizon. They're in very plain sight. The ones that are south of Block Island, I see from Amagansett. So I think we have to have green energy. We have to end fossil fuels, but I don't think we have to do that by industrializing the wild ocean while enabling the future existence of a monopoly that has essentially no jobs associated with those structures.
That's a really good point as well. And, I think I've been doing some reporting on Earthships, in New Mexico, and it's all off the grid living, and they have these earth shelter designs like built into the earth, and it's similar concept to geothermal, of like using the ground to cool and heat. And when that started, the solar technology wasn't as great as it is now. The lithium batteries, it seems crazy that we've come so far technologically speaking, that we're still kind of relying on this old grid.
Yeah, it is crazy. But the people who are making a lot of money off the way things have been are, continuing to lobby very hard to make sure that things go in their direction. And all the other people that could have a stake in a much better way of doing things, they don't exist yet. So that's why it's skewed like that.
And with the wind farms, what are your fears for pelagic birds, whales?
Well, in Europe, it seems that the pelagic birds don't recognize these wind farm fields as open ocean, and they avoid those areas. So that takes a lot of feeding habitat away from those birds, if that is true. As I have read in various places, and some of the bird protection groups in Europe have tried unsuccessfully to stop those facilities from going. Obviously, birds get killed in the blades, and migrating bats would get killed in the blades if they went there. Those things go around very, very, very fast.
And they're huge, too.
And studying that is essentially impossible, because if they're on land, you can go around the bottom and see how many dead birds there are in the morning. You can't do that in the ocean. So all of those things, I think, are really not the way that I would have liked to see things go.
Your most recent book, Becoming Wild, examines animal culture across the world, looking at sperm whales, macaw parrots, and chimpanzees. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend. It's like very humanizing look at these animals. What was your most surprising takeaway from spending time with those three animals?
Well, I think it's kind of what you just said. It's not a humanizing look at the animals. It's a real look at the animals, and what we see when we really look at them is there are individuals. They have different individual personalities. We don't really have a good word for personality in a non-person, but anyway, they are individuals, and they have to learn when they're young how to be wild, how to survive in the wild. And they usually learn that from their social groups, or sometimes directly from their mothers. So there are a lot of things that are like very similar to how life is for us, and how we learn, and how our cultures have certain arbitrary things that we do that are just different from the way another group does it. And there's a lot of that kind of thing in a lot of other animals. Their cultures don't look anything like ours, and they're not as well, most of them are not technological at all, or barely technological, but behaviorally there are a lot of kind of complicated and rich things that they have to do. Chimpanzees obviously rely a lot on making tools, and the tools that they make vary from place to place because their cultures vary, and what they learn from their parents about how do we live here. That's really what culture is. Culture is the answer to the question, how do we live here? It's not, culture is not sports and religion and fashion. Those are products of human culture. But the reason that sports and religions and fashions vary is because how people live here varies from place to place. And that's true of many species. So you have to learn how to be wild. That's why it's called Becoming Wild, in quite a lot of social species. And if you don't know how to live. So if you are raised in captivity and somebody just opens the door somewhere, most of those animals have a very low chance of surviving. And this is very important when you think about reintroducing species that have been wiped out of an area. It's not just as simple as, oh, we'll put more back, because they don't necessarily know how to live there or where the migration routes are. And there's various examples of that. You know, if some places bighorn sheep were shot out in the Rockies or in the Olympics, and they took sheep from some other place to reintroduce them. Well, that's great in the summer. If they're at 5,000 feet or 7,000 feet and there's plenty of grass and everything's green and nice, when it starts to turn brutal, they don't know where to go. There's nobody to follow. They don't know where the migration routes to the lowlands are. They don't know the lowlands even exist. Normally, they would just follow everybody. The young ones would. So they die in droves. There was a reintroduction of a parrot called the thick-billed parrot in the southwest U.S. They all died. They just took some, they bred them in captivity, they brought them out, they opened the doors. That's abandonment, basically, because they didn't know, what do you eat here? Where's the water? Who's dangerous? What do we do at night? And they died. So that's a real danger of allowing an entire population to vanish, because what goes with that is the culture, the answer to the question, how do we live here?
I think there was the example of the elephant herds and how in times of drought, the herds with the oldest female, they were able to go to lands that, like, I guess decades ago.
That their family last visited 20 or 30 years earlier. And those really old females had families that survived the drought. And the ones that had younger females who didn't know where to go when it got that bad, they suffered a lot of them died of thirst.
Which I think, in the book you make the case for that's why we need to conserve these animals. It's not just, obviously we should conserve them, but that the loss of that knowledge and that culture, as we think of like genetic diversity, but there's also obviously cultural diversity.
Yes, right. Conservation is usually based on ideas about genetic diversity, but cultural knowledge gets lost before genetic viability gets lost as population numbers go down.
Well, another example that I loved was the New York City pigeons use motion. They can open doors with motion sensors.
Yeah, they learn how to do that, yeah. I've been in the subway. There are pigeons walking around, and they obviously know how to get in and out, but I don't know how they first learned to do that. But they follow each other in.
And I've heard you speak about the whaling industry, and we've talked about this a little, as how a lot of people think whales all died in the 1800s, but in fact, humans have had a huge impact, and when whaling industry industrialized, that was horrific for them. I've also heard you speak about whale memories, and that you have noticed that since we've protected more whales, that they're more open to humans. Can you share a little bit about that? Or is there certain kinds? I know sperm whales, you've said, are more, or have been more hesitant.
Well, they've been more hesitant to interact with people past a certain point, because what started happening with sperm whales is that there were certain families that were much more amenable to people approaching them, and people overdid that a little bit. So they got a little tired of that, and and also they have things to do. They have to hunt, they have to travel. They can't really be interacting with people all the time. So some of those whales that had been very friendly, they got a little more skittish about being, they don't want to have as much to do with people. And that's true also with the orca whales in the Pacific Northwest. They used to find people very, very interesting. But
like a few decades ago.
Yeah, like a few decades ago, but now there's so many boats and people aren't afraid of them anymore. So they follow them around. And, for the orcas, people are no longer a novelty. They're a little bit of a pain. So, they kind of make themselves scarce in ways that they didn't used to.
What are some tips? Obviously, you've observed a lot of animals in the wild. What are tips for the average person when they see an animal? I know here we get seals, and you can see bad behaviors. So what would you tell people at home to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really love telling people to stay away from everything, because I think it's important that we, embrace the richness of life that we have around us, but to just be respectful and be slow about things, and try to be very sensitive to any animal that looks like it's a little nervous or just wants to put some distance between you. Let them do it. Don't keep chasing them or following them around. There was that ridiculous thing about that dolphin in the Gulf of Mexico recently. It was in distress, and it came basically ashore. It was stranded in the shallows, and people started putting kids on its back and taking pictures, and it drowned. It died because it drowned because there were people sitting on it.
Oh my gosh. So don't sit on the wild animals.
Don't sit on the dolphins, I would say, is rule one.
If you could make decisions on how to spend federal infrastructure dollars, what would your priorities be for the East End of Long Island?
Oh, the East End of Long Island. Well, I think there's going to be higher water and stronger storms. So I think that if we want to continue living as close to the water as we like, we're going to have to live farther up off the ground. If you go to the Gulf Coast, there are thousands of houses along the coast that are up on high pilings.
Yeah.
It's not my favorite look, but without that, a lot of homes are likely to be heavily damaged or destroyed. And right now we have federal flood insurance that pays people to build back in very risky places. That insurance is getting really, really expensive, but I don't think it's a good expenditure at all. I think a managed retreat, if you're going to pay people to do anything, a managed retreat, which is not easy to configure, that does make the most sense. And short of that, the houses right along the shore, they're going to have to come up or you're going to go down.
Yeah, I've spent some time on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and it's really interesting what they're doing there with some of those barrier islands, and everything is like 2 stories off. And then you'll even see like the newer ones, their generator is also off.
Yeah, sure.
That otherwise, you're basically accepting that your area will be flooded for weeks of the year.
Well, not that long ago, very few people lived on those barrier beaches. And when I was 18, I drove to Cape Hatteras, and I remember miles and miles and miles and miles of sea oats and dunes and sand and the ocean, and then I came to the Kitty Hawk Monument. Well, if you take that drive now, it's miles and miles and miles and miles of houses, malls, houses, malls, houses, and then the Kitty Hawk Monument. And now we're supposed to protect all those houses and malls that are in a really dangerous place. And that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think if you want to take a risk, that's fine with me. I'm not in the business of protecting everybody from themselves. If you want to take a risk and you might lose your house, go ahead and try it. That's okay. But then don't ask us to pay for it.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And I know even here, when I speak with farmers, a lot of them are like, yeah, we used to have a summer shack on the beach, and, every 10 years it would blow down. And now, we have these like multi-million-dollar mansions on the beach that all the old timers and, Shinnecock are like, that is not, you need 100-year hurricane.
Right.
So, you share such beautiful stories from the sea and the land. And as you just said, agriculture's maybe our humans' like biggest impact on the world and animals. What do you eat?
What do I eat?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I say some from the soil, some from the sea, none from the pens. So.
Oh, that's good. That could be like a really long bumper sticker.
Yeah, it could be. You need a wide load truck for that bumper sticker. Yeah. So I mean, I eat plants, and I like to buy local, and I like to buy seasonal, and I like to buy from people who I recognize their faces. That's really good. we have a vegetable garden. We're lucky. We're very lucky in a lot of ways. We have a vegetable garden. We catch fish, and go clamming, and I don't buy any farmed animal meat at all ever.
Even if it was like from Mecox Bay Dairy, like farms locally.
Well, I have to admit I got some cheese from them recently. I do have a bit of a weakness for cheese, and I happen to know one of the people there. So, and we've had some nice and very interesting conversations about the ethics of animal farming, ever really, like some people would say it's never ethical, and other people would say if you do this, this, and this, it's a matter, I guess it's a matter of tolerances for everybody, and what kind of life you want to be part of.
Got it. But so you would advise people a little bit from the land, a little from the sea, and no pens.
Well, that's my personal
your ethos.
view. I don't really advise people on what to eat. I'm happy to talk about what I think is right and good for me. I mean, I know people who are vegans. I know kind of a lot of people who are vegans, and I know some of them who are sort of professional vegans because they talk and write about it. And they think that fishing is a horrible thing to do. You are inflicting pain. The fish are panicked. That's true. I do it for a variety of reasons, and I'm happy to talk about those reasons if you want to go into that. But we all have different tolerances. I think that the problem with almost all animal farming, and mostly you get meat where you really don't have any idea where it came from. This is true of almost everything about our lives. We don't know where our food comes from. We might think, oh, our dog is so stupid. She thinks her food comes out of a bag. Well, we're so smart because we know the bag comes from the supermarket.
Yeah.
That's all we know about it. We're no smarter than they are. We have no idea where the food comes from. We don't know where our water comes from, really, or how that works. We don't know, most of us don't really understand, where the sewer systems go to or what happens to anything. We don't know where all the oil and all the gas that we use comes from. We don't understand our own lives. So the thing about most animal farming is, other than its total anonymity, a tremendous amount of natural land is wrecked to provide food for livestock, especially in the tropics. A lot of Brazil, the whole eastern dry forest of Brazil has been destroyed in the last 40 years, mostly to grow soybeans to raise cows in North America and Europe. So, to take it to extremes, you eat beef, you're killing monkeys. But who thinks about any of that? Because we don't know where it comes from. And most of those animals are made to live much more miserably than they're allowed to die. There are laws about how you have to kill them so that they suffer a little less, even though the whole thing is, to me, is a horror show. If you go fishing, the fish gets to be who it's supposed to be until you catch it. And we use a lot of restraint when we go fishing. And some people really like catch and release, and they say, well, you're not killing the fish. And I used to think that, and I used to do that. And my wife doesn't like that because she's, we're hurting all these fish, and I don't think it's so much fun to hurt the fish. So instead of catch and release, now we call it kill and go home. We go to get dinner.
That would not be a good bumper sticker.
when we get dinner, we're done. And actually, it's kind of nicer because you have a really nice trip that takes less time, and it's nice. And then you have all this beautiful food,
Yeah, I think especially the connection to nature, and what you're saying about animals is true. It's crazy. There's so few laws like protecting them in their life, even with organic farming. It doesn't really apply to animals. I just want one more quick question, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
One thing that I found so interesting was about the sperm whale codas.
Yes.
and that they have these languages and that they won't hang out with people or the whales in the other groups.
Uh-huh.
Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really cool thing about these sperm whales is that the whales live in family groups that are all the females live together with their youngsters. When the males get to be adolescents, they go off and they have a different kind of a life. It's a lot like African elephants, actually. They live, so all the females stay basically with their mother and the sisters and their children. And those are families. A bunch of families that will socialize with each other is what scientists call a clan. So in sperm whale society, there are families that will socialize with other families, but they won't socialize with another group of families. So one clan, everybody can mix, and the other clan, they can mix, but the two clans will avoid each other. And they know who they are because with a series of clicks that's kind of like Morse code, they announce who they are as an individual, what family they belong to, and what clan their family belongs to. So if they hear somebody from another clan, they will avoid them. If they hear somebody from the same clan, they will usually swim toward them and socialize. And why would they do anything like that? Because they have different answers to the question of how do we live here. The different clans hunt differently, migrate differently, travel at different kinds of speeds and patterns. And if you are with somebody who does things the way you do it, you can do it. If you're with somebody who does things totally differently, you are confused and you can't really cooperate. And that's what culture does. It's what culture does in people. The easiest thing about that is if you are with somebody who speaks your own language, you can have a conversation easily. If they don't, you might struggle or find it impossible. So you tend to hang out with people who are like you. We do tend to do that, and so do a lot of other animals that also have culture.
Thank you. I won't have enough time for audience questions, but I think that's so important to kind of show that diversity in animals and what hopefully we can try to protect for the next generation.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to know who we are here with on this planet.
Yeah, and it's always much more deeper or much more interesting, I think, than we don't give animals enough credit.
Right.
So audience questions?
What's going on at the Safina Center with some of the projects that your students are working on?
Oh, okay. Sure. Well, I have a small not-for-profit group. It's called the Safina Center. And we have 2 fellowship programs. One is for people who are grown-ups in their mid-career, and the other is for people who are just starting out in their career. So we have a junior fellowship and a mid-career fellowship. And those people, the whole idea of the fellowships is to find people and to help advance the work of people who are trying to help make an emotional connection with the natural world based on facts. Some of them are scientists, some are writers, some are photographers. So it's based on facts, but they're not just listing facts or reporting facts in a strictly scientific way. They're mostly telling stories of one kind or another, or they're bringing more people into conservation. One of the things that I'm really, really proud about our little group and the fellows we have now, we have, I think, a higher percentage of non-white people in our group than any other environmental group that I know of.
Oh, that's great.
And some of them, their specific work is to be role models and bring in other people who have usually been really shut out of conservation work, either directly or because of all the other really indirect ways that people who don't have a lot of advantages or don't see anybody who looks like them or isn't expected to succeed, gets further disadvantaged. So we're trying to help break that barrier down. And I know on the East End, I've been hearing more about the shinnicocks in the last 3 or 4 years than ever before. I think people are starting to, kind of realize that we're here with some indigenous people and they have some things to say to us.
Definitely, yeah. And that's so great that you're kind of putting resources behind that as well.
Yeah.
As a leader in the modern environmental movement and a mentor to many environmentalists, who were some of your mentors in your career, and when can we expect your next book to be published?
Well, my next book I'm just finishing now, so it'll probably be out in about a year because it takes a ridiculously long time from the time you're done. But anyway, maybe my single greatest hero was Peter Matheson, a famous literary icon here on the East End, and I got to know him in his last 20 years of life. Before that, he was just this larger-than-life figure, and I first came across his books when I was an adolescent, and I simply had no idea that a person could have a life that big and that exciting. And it occurred to me that maybe, in addition to trying to travel and see some of these horizons that he wrote about, maybe I would write about it someday. So there was him. There were a couple of professors who were really hugely important to me, and I think a hard thing about teaching or working with young people is that the results are often really hard to see, and they often don't really bear fruit until decades later. I sometimes tell a story about when I was 17 years old, I went on a bird count, and there's hardly any really young people or teenagers involved. I know the South Fork Natural History Museum makes a real effort. That's really what their mission is, to get young people out into nature and nature to young people. But especially when I was a teenager, there kind of wasn't anything like that. The Audubon groups, everybody was in their 40s or older. There was this huge gap. So I was 17 years old. I go on a bird count. They sent me with this old guy, and he didn't know me from a hole in the wall, and vice versa. And he showed me a red-bellied woodpecker, and I had never seen a red-bellied woodpecker before, and I thought it was really cool. Now, it didn't exactly change my life, but I never forgot that moment, and I never got to tell him that it turned out to be a big deal for me. To him, he just took this hippie 17-year-old out birding, and I probably didn't talk that much because I was shy and I didn't know him, and maybe he thought I was not that friendly because of that. You just don't know with young people. You have to invest the time and effort on the faith that it can change a life, and you may not know it.
That birder that you took, the 17-year-old hippie, then will go on to write tens of environmental books and
teach young people in his time. I did all of that, and some of these people you never get to say thank you to, which is why I make a point of saying thank you to those who are still around. I tried for decades to locate my 6th grade teacher.
Oh.
And when I did, which was last fall, so my 6th grade teacher, I didn't find him until last November, and he had died 3 months earlier.
Oh, wow. But do you think he followed your work?
I don't know.
I bet he did.
His niece said she was sure he must, because he was so interested in all his students all his life. Maybe she was being very nice, and maybe he did. I don't know. I hope so.
And one more question. Okay. Thank you for watching South Fork Sea Farmers today with Dr. Carl Safina. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you.